Questions, comments, engagements? The floor is yours.
Okay, because nobody else put their hand up, this is awkward. And because I'm going first, it's half thought through. Thank you, Joel. That was incredibly stimulating. So, I guess this isn't really a question, it's more sort of a comment. What I'm thinking about is what the ideas that you're presenting in your paper mean for the area in which I work, which is customary law. And so I had a moment as you were articulating, Biko's prophetic articulation and vision, that it sort of struck me that part of what we struggle with customary law in particular, and with living customary law as a system, is that you're trying to give customary law or create a space for customary law at the table alongside common law. And so, the things that are sort of uppermost in my mind is some of the recent legislation that's been passed by Parliament. And the default position in a lot of that work is to replicate systems of governance that stem from the previous apartheid era. And so as you articulate the ideas in your paper, it sort of clicks into place for me that, of course, the only thing we can reach for is a replication of what we know, because you're not trying to engage with customary law on its own terms, because, of course, you're trying to find a place for it at the table that's already been set. And so it seems to me that for customary law in particular, actually, the only way that you can develop a coherent and self-standing system is actually, as you articulate, on the ruins of the current post-apartheid legal system. Which is a really scary thought, right? Because the difficulty, and again, I'm focusing particularly on customary law because it's my area, is that there are flaws within the customary law system. And I guess my half-baked question, is, if you are trying to build on the ruins, and you're using customary law as an example, how do you make sure that you're not replicating some of the darkness that exists within, African fields of law, African systems of law? The big one that gets thrown around is often patriarchy, but I think there are other shortcomings. And so the question around, how we build mindful of the traps. But really, the clearest part of this ramble is to say that thank you, this is really useful in terms of thinking about customer law.
Let's take a few. I want to have answers to all the profound questions. By the way, I'm scared too, I don't have that constitution. But I'm happy to face it with everyone else. Other questions?
My power here. My question is linked to Nolundi's, which is, what does this mean for us practically? When we talk about the law, when we talk about these legal institutions, what does it look like when we are saying we need to completely break down the institutions themselves? In the earlier session, you mentioned that race is a constituting element in South Africa. So it literally, South Africa is born out of the concept of race. And so any kind of conception, any kind of solution that we have has to deal with breaking that down. But I guess what I'm asking is what remains when we do that, and how do we do that?
Hi Joel, thanks, that was fascinating. So my question is, I've recently been reading Tembeka and Tukaitovi's book on a history of black lawyers, and I'm wondering, in terms of the tradition that he outlines of Pixley Kaseme, Alfred Mangena, where do you, through the lens that you've outlined, which I find very convincing in terms of the sidelining of a more radical tradition than, say, the one that Tembeka outlined in his book, where do we see those sorts of black lawyers and intellectuals, the Pixley Kasemes of the early 20th century, late 19th?
Okay, let me take these few, then maybe people will have the courage to ask more questions. As I say, these are things I'm thinking about as well. But let me start with the last question. Tembeka's book, The Land is Ours. For me, there's some fundamental. So let me start by saying the complimentary thing. When I was in the US recently, they said whenever you say something, start with a compliment and then say what you really think. So the compliment is that. it's a real compliment, I mean it, is that for me that book is important because it is really, in my own recent memory, the first real work in black legal history. And I'm embarrassed to say it came outside of the academy. So that book is important because it registered for me that something is clearly not happening in the Black Legal Academy, that kind of book would be produced outside of our precincts. It's an exceptionally important work of not simply centering black people in legal history, but really rethinking fundamentally how legal historical research ought to be conducted, and the role of lawyers in the making of the new order. I really mean that, and for that reason, that book in some ways has some affinity with this project. There are two fundamental problems. I mean, the fundamental antinomy, this divide that I've been talking about, is between those who say the land is ours and those who say the land belongs to all of us. Now, the lawyers in Tembeka's book belong to the tradition that the land belongs to all of us. So on the one hand, for me, there's some conceptual problem with marking that tradition as a decolonization tradition, rather than as a tradition of elite natives who were instrumental in the spread of Western legal modernity. So yes, the kind of figures I'm trying to trace here are in some ways in direct opposition to the figures and the narrative that Nuredobi is trying to draw out in that book, notwithstanding what I've just said about the conceptual importance of the book as a project, the fact that other people should be doing it with other lawyers and so forth. Sobukwe and Biko were lawyers. Well, Biko wanted to study law but didn't, chose medicine because law just attracted too much political trouble for him and his older brother. So for me, the jurisprudence of Steve Biko, or a black radical jurisprudence, would completely be in opposition to exactly that. Because to me, those are the founders of the Congress tradition. They're important in their own way, they lived epic lives, but they are not in the black radical tradition. So I already said, I'm also scared of what will happen after we abolish the Constitution. Part of the answer would be a slight cop-out. What I'm first trying to throw out is that our entire political imaginary and our entire the conceptual structure of the disciplines centers on an unproblematized notion of South Africa. And if in fact people who studied South Africa in their disciplines didn't take it for granted and in fact asked questions about its foundations and its possible undoing and replacement, then the possibilities that flow from that would also look different. So there are different places and different small local contexts. I was just in the United States, in Jackson, Mississippi, where the Lumumba family there is experimenting with what they call black radical government. It's just an example of what it means to constitute a revolutionary government. And there are a few other experiments, for example, in stronger forms of legal pluralism, in places like Bolivia, what some people are experimenting with plurinationalism. So there's a wide range of experiments that are available. I must say, I don't have a particular commitment yet to a particular model or a form of state or form of government. I just know that the ones that we have are not simply problematic for generating certain material problems, but they also prevent us from seeing the possibility of another way of doing things. And that will be an absolute collective project that can only be possible if the academy is also turned upside down. On the customary law question, Nolundi, I completely agree, but I'll say this about the whole problematics of customary law and African history and African culture. I started by suggesting that the problem we're dealing with here is an irreparable problem, is an unforgivable problem, and it's interminable. We know that we can no longer assert a pure origin story. There will be no pure pre-colonial form that we can draw on that will help us. And there will be no pure form of legal pluralism that will take us out of the hegemony of state law, unless we think about really bigger global anti-imperialist projects, which in fact some people are doing. Part of the remaking of African customary law, I think, will have to involve letting go of its pure origins. And dealing with rural-urban divides and really dealing with some of these. Part of the source of reconstructing African customary law is African philosophy, I think. But we have to be prepared to recognize that there's something we've lost that we'll never get again. And that should be the starting point. It's an unsatisfactory answer, but that's kind of...
It's actually difficult to ask a question to somebody with whom you largely agree. But
questions don't have to be about disagreement. It can also be a compliment.
Absolutely. No compliments. Okay. But what you said something which I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on about coloniality and colonialism being difficult or not lending themselves to periodization. But the reality of it is that in a lot of intellectual work or the scholarly enterprise more generally, this historicization or periodization is done quite easily. There are seminal moments in 1652, 1806, 1899, and various other dates. So I'd like you to just elaborate on that point a little bit, and then I note that you use this term of colonial apartheid rather than speaking of colonialism and apartheid. Can you just talk to that a little bit? Elaborate on your preference for that particular articulation.
Thank you, Dr. Modiri. That was very stimulating. My name is Annalisa, and I'm doing my master's here at the faculty. So my work is centered around changing the rhetoric of transformation, BEE, and you basically work on throwing the whole thing away. So really there's opposition in ideology within academia, and I was wondering if in your work really, is there an actual room for compromise? Because ultimately, there will always be opposition, and even though I completely agree with the notions you've raised here today, there will always be a difference in methodology. There will always be a difference in how we conceptualize a new South Africa, quote unquote. So, is there room for compromise in your eyes, or am I just a sellout?
Thanks, Peter Schwickard. It's a very short question. Is it possible to get rid of the legacy of white supremacy without rejecting?
My name is Naledi. I'm an undergrad LLB student. So my question is, great, believe in your sentiments and all of that. I just wanted to know, how would your paper then translate into legal education, where the boundaries or sort of the lines of demarcation as to how far we can critique the Constitution was sort of withheld until we get to our final stages of our degree. So we would be in a first year class and you would feel a sense of discomfort, but you're obviously not equipped with the language of the law, which is how they expect you to argue your critiques. And some people may draw from like the social sciences and stuff to articulate the critiques, but that's normally like never really accepted or engaged within the classroom space. So then my question becomes is, what's the role of the lecturer, particularly the lecturer who believes themselves to be progressive in some way or the other? Who believes themselves to be progressive in some way or the other, because we can't do much about those who aren't or choose not to be.
We can, but yeah.
Okay, in the classroom, I'm not sure what we can do. So my question is, how would this look like in legal education, the contestation, critical contestation of the Constitution at an undergrad level?
Okay. I'll again start with this. One of the things that I should have mentioned in the previous session around, for example, the emergence of critical race theory in the US Academy, was that what simply happened is that a group of students got together outside of the curriculum, really. They got a professor in the school to offer an alternative constitutional law class, for example, which would center certain historical and political questions, which would start not from some pure notion of the Constitution, but would take slavery as a founding disruptive. So part of how this will translate into legal education is by students with the interest forcing that conversation on the table in both extracurricular and curricular form. But let me just say something about the critique of the Constitution, because lots of people, especially some of my colleagues here at UCT who aren't here today, become very hysterical about the Constitution. Like sort of, don't touch this, you know. My real critique, my real fundamental critique about what I call constitutional worship is not, I have a specific political historical critique of the Constitution, right? But for legal education, my position is the aim of legal education is not to teach students to worship the law, or it's to teach students to have a critical reflection on the law, on any law, on any constitution. You'll remember that the roots of the problem of apartheid legal education was that people were being inducted into an obedience into the current legal order, and therefore were being prevented from the possibility of being part of a new legal order. And so I think it's bad that people in the legal academy think that the worship of the Constitution is the right place to start. I think in first year, when you teach students where the Constitution comes from, you explain to them what the Constitution is about, what its contents are, but you also say, actually, in '94, there's lots of contestation. There was this argument and that argument and that argument about the Constitution. Because in a time like this, where the Constitution's authority as a symbolic pillar that holds us together as South Africans is disintegrating, everybody is headless now. Because the only relation you had to the Constitution was one of worship and obedience, and that it was untouchable. I think it's bad to teach students what we call legal theology, like the worship of the law. No, teach students a critical relation to any law. Even the decolonized Constitution, you've got to have a critical relation to it as well. It's not like, the law is not something you worship in, it's not a religion, you know. So that would be my central contribution to the approach to legal education, that the point is not to induct students into the hegemonic legal culture, but to give them the skills to practice critical reflection on the law. The other context is this, and like the white progressive legal academics came up at a time, so this is like the little bit where I feel I am sympathetic to I understand where the hysteria comes from. They emerged at a time when there was a massive conservative assault by more conservative whites against the transition. And so at that time, it would have been impossible for them to take a position against the Constitution, because they needed that Constitution to be the blueprint for a transformed society, and so that they could respond to the more conservative legal academics that they found. So I get it. I mean, I get why for the past 20 years, that deep commitment to constitutional transformation was necessary in order to silence certain kinds of white conservatism in the academy. But I think now that time of that project has ended. And perhaps the challenge to them, all of them, is what's next? You know, because this constitution now is under much clearer contest. It's not as stable as it once was. But I don't think every single concern that we have as students should be addressed in the curriculum. I think you should just read for yourself and do your own thing. In other words, don't give the university the power to define your intellectual subjectivity. You have a right to demand that they teach some of it, but I think there's a dimension in which you own your own education and your own becoming human, which is really what it is about. I hope that helps. On the question, on the person, yeah, is it possible to get rid of white? No. I think any serious anti-racism is always already an anti-capitalism. It's not necessarily a Marxism, but it is an anti-capitalism of some kind. And we have to start thinking, not simply for purposes of social and historical justice, but for the survival of the planet, about some different models of economic governance. So, absolutely. The BEE question, affirmative action, all the kind of racial charity schemes. Let me say this, and I mentioned it in the, so I'm not opposed to, for example, affirmative action for numerical minorities in those societies, for people who need to be led into structures of power in order for them to map onto grids of power, to have some access to resources and so forth. I think South Africa made a big mistake by taking the affirmative action model, which came out of two historical contexts. One context where blacks are a racial minority, the US, and context of sort of European women's emergence into the public sphere. Because that acquiesces too much too quickly to the idea that all we want is a seat at the table, all we want is South Africa as it is. And affirmative action itself is producing all kinds of things. So black people are called affirmative action appointments, for example, producing its own stigmatizing effects, if I were to call it that way. So right now, as far as the debate here at UCT and other places are concerned, I would absolutely support affirmative action, if that's how we get people in the door. But I just don't want people to call that liberation or freedom. In fact, I think it's a perverse kind of unfreedom. I think it marks the one being led in always as already historically inferior, but it also, what it does is it prevents the structures themselves from being radically transformed. And you can see what BEE has done to black people's political and cultural sensibilities. Like, you know, I'm talking about like what I was saying about the champagne, people washing their hands with champagne, showing that, I mean, really deplorable stuff, you know, people who get tenders to build schools and don't do so, but have huge houses and 3, 4, 5 cars, and are taking, I think it's in fact disintegrated some of the cultural and social norms necessary for a community to reclaim its own freedom. So I think we made a big mistake by taking the BEE and affirmative action model. The let me in models, I think, are very problematic. And were you the one who asked, is there room for compromise? I'm sure there is, but the point I'm making about compromise, so you would be led to believe that compromise is sort of the way sensible, rational people behave. You and I disagree, so you can have some, I can have some. But I'm suggesting, among other things, that the nature of the settler colonial racial order in South Africa was intended to be total and absolute. So what you think is a compromise with it is in fact preserving it. And that we can see has happened in South Africa. So my argument about particularly settler colonial forms of racism is they can't be compromised with. They've entrenched themselves in such a way as to be permanent, and therefore the only way to get rid of them is to abolish them completely, but that seems entirely impossible to us. And that's why we feel stuck. And that's why we decide to choose the more reasonable, pragmatic solutions. So I would just caution against the idea that compromise can fix the problem. For me, for example, one of the most pernicious effects of compromise in South Africa was